interpreters. So my name is Melissa Blue Sky. I'm a senior attorney here at CL. I'm glad you've been able to join this webinar with us today to discuss lessons learned from different treaties to inform effective decision-making for the future plastic treaty. Just some quick logistics. I'll provide a quick overview and introduction to the session, followed by presentations by two speakers before wrapping up to transition to questions. Our aim is to have about half an hour for questions and discussion after the presentations. Due to the number of people who have joined, we are requesting that if you'd like to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A section. We'll take, a couple of questions at a time and try to address as many as possible. If there is extra time at the end, we will be able to enable the raise hand feature for people to ask questions. But of course, that's time dependent. And if you would like a specific speaker or person to answer the question, please note too. So that's all for the overview and logistics. I'll start the introduction and then hand it over to the panelists. As many of you know, the fourth meeting of the International Negotiating Committee, or INC4, for the Plastics Treaty is scheduled to begin in Ottawa in less than 2 weeks. Right now, a small handful of countries have insisted that voting shouldn't be used to make decisions on substantive issues. But this absence of clear decision-making procedures really favors the positions of members who are really the most reluctant to take the needed actions to end plastic pollution. And it also really poses significant challenges for the negotiations overall and operation of the future treaty. So as we work to develop this new treaty, it's useful to note that adopted rules of procedure with clear voting has been really supportive of other INCs in their treaty negotiations. And it's also important to consider the potential long-term impacts for the success of a treaty if voting is not an option and decisions need to be taken by consensus. Just as an example, the Rotterdam Convention requires consensus to add new substances to annexes. So even though there's a very detailed scientific process and way for recommendations to add substances to be made, a small number of parties have blocked the inclusion of substances like asbestos for the past 17 years. Our two speakers are going to provide more detailed examples from other treaties that show the importance of voting, both as an instrument for compromise and decision-making where voting is available, or when voting isn't available as a roadblock to action. So with me today, we have Carol Moffett, President and CEO of the Center for International Environmental Law. Carol's a recognized expert on international environmental law and a leader in the emerging fields of climate litigation and climate-related financial and legal risks. He's co-authored many of CL's publications, including the Fueling Plastic series that examines linkages between fossil fuels and the global plastics crisis. And he'll focus his remarks on the challenges of consensus in the UNFCCC space and the importance of voting in the development of the Plastics Treaty. We also have with us Sarah Brochet, who is Science Advisor and Global lead paint elimination campaign manager from IPEN, which is the International Pollutants Elimination Network. She works on a wide range of issues related to chemical safety, which includes development of scientific and technical studies and reports, as well as international policy engagement in treaties such as the Basel and Stockholm Conventions. Today, she'll be discussing how the availability of voting supports the effectiveness of those treaties. And so with that, I'll conclude the introduction and hand over to Carol. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Melissa. And thank you all for joining us for this conversation on what is a really critical issue for every environmental agreement and every environmental negotiation, but is absolutely central to the long-term success of the plastic treaty negotiations. Before turning to the UNFCCC, I want to just briefly touch on two treaties that are widely considered the most successful environmental treaties of all, the Montreal Protocol and the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. Both of those treaties have been heralded not only for their widespread participation, but for the way that they have grown organically over time to address new issues, to rapidly increase ambition, increase the scope of the agreement, far beyond their original vision, allowing those treaties to achieve their initial goals and move on to greater successes. Neither the Montreal Protocol nor CITES is perfect. Neither the Montreal Protocol nor CITES is perfect. But both of these treaties have, in the views of participants, states, and observers alike, been hallmarks of what effective international lawmaking can be. And one of the key elements to that success for both treaties has been that ability of the conferences of the parties of both CITES and the Montreal Protocol to seek consensus to the greatest degree possible. And where consensus does not exist, to vote. By a simple majority on procedural matters and by a super majority, but nonetheless an achievable majority on substantive matters. That ability to vote, to take difficult decisions together and move forward together has been instrumental in the success of those agreements, and instrumental in delivering on the missions that those agreements set out to achieve. And it's against that backdrop that the contrast with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change becomes particularly stark. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is more than 30 years old. We have been through 28 conferences of the parties to the UNFCCC, and we are headed towards the 29th. And there are virtually no serious observers to the UNFCCC who would argue that it has accomplished the purposes for which it was created. We have seen, even as the climate crisis has grown more stark, even as greenhouse gas emissions have continued to grow, have continued to accelerate, the UNFCCC has struggled to confront the fundamental drivers of the climate crisis. Nowhere is this clearer than in the ongoing and really active debates 30 years into the history of this treaty over whether and how it might confront the fossil fuels that are responsible for 80% or more of global greenhouse gas emissions. So what accounts for these challenges? What accounts for this staggering inertia in the face of overwhelming, not only science, but widespread public support and public demand in many countries for action? And indeed, demands from the vast majority of the world's countries to take more serious action, both to mitigate climate change and to address its growing impacts. The answer is simple. One of the key failings of the UNFCCC process has been and remains that the parties cannot take decisions on any basis other than consensus. This is no accident. At the very first conference of the parties to the climate convention, the parties were presented with draft rules of procedure. Those draft rules of procedure included, as every treaty had before then, clear rules for decision making that included seeking consensus wherever possible, and where consensus was not possible, taking a majority vote with each state, each country having one vote in the process, and the supermajority of countries being able to decide together, this is what we will do. At that first conference of the parties, a single state moved to block the adoption of those rules of procedure, specifically to block the adoption of the voting provision. That maneuver to block the adoption of the rules of procedure and force the parties to the UNFCCC into a default consensus requirement for every decision has led to literally 30 years of inertia in this treaty. It has forced every decision, not only big decisions at the end of the conference, but every decision in every working group, in every breakout group, to default to the requirements of the most reluctant, the most resistant parties. It's forced everything to the lowest common denominator. And this is not only reflected in the lack of ambition and the lack of movement to mitigate the impacts of climate change. For many countries in the global south, it is particularly evident in the continuing failures to mobilize the financial resources needed to respond to the climate crisis. And most recently, we've seen it not only in the fight over addressing fossil fuels as a driver of the climate crisis, but in the creation and critically the financing of a loss and damage mechanism to deal with mounting costs and impacts for the most vulnerable countries in the world. The UNFCCC is an object lesson in what not to do if you want to achieve the objectives of an environmental agreement. And one of the most fundamental things that it has taught us through 30 long years is consensus is a very direct route to inertia, to bogged down processes, to endless negotiations that lead to very limited outcomes. And I think there is a really profound lesson for that as we look over the last three sessions of the INC, the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee for the Global Plastics Treaty. When we came into Uruguay, there were draft rules of procedure presented that included and recognized the right to the requirement to seek consensus first, and then recognize that if consensus wasn't possible, parties needed to take a vote by a simple majority on procedural matters, by a supermajority on substantive matters, take a vote, take a decision, and move ahead. In Uruguay, we saw a small but concerted group of countries work to, even after the decision was gavelled through and there was a decision to apply the rules on a provisional basis, we saw a concerted effort by a small group of countries to block that voting mechanism and force the INC into a default consensus requirement. We saw this play out even more severely at the INC in Paris, and we started to see the real consequences of it in the profound inertia that characterized the Nairobi negotiations of the INC. we are now halfway through the negotiating process. It's a very ambitious timeline for a very ambitious treaty. And what we see now is we're faced with a revised zero draft that is overflowing with not only brackets, but competing options and visions for the text, many of which are fundamentally incompatible with the goals that UNEA set out for the parties in the mandate for the INC. So, how do you resolve that? What we've seen thus far is there's been no way to resolve that in the absence of a voting mechanism. We will be heading into Ottawa with that default consensus requirement, not formally on the books, but nonetheless built into the process. It is unlikely that that will fully change in Ottawa, but it is absolutely essential that that change, if we're ultimately to secure an ambitious, comprehensive, legally binding treaty, because there's no other way to do it. And this is really key, not only because of the implications of decision making for the treaty itself, for the global plastic treaty itself, but also the implications for the long-term success of the treaty. It will be the conference of the parties of the global plastics treaty who are ultimately responsible for adding new substances, adding new materials, adding to phase out timelines, to limitations, to lists of subsidies. But that task will become insurmountable if they're required to agree by consensus to every addition to those lists. And this is why routinely successful conferences of the parties also have provisions for non-consensus decision making. The question is, how do you get non-consensus decision making out of the conference parties or into the conference of the parties without first addressing it in the negotiating process for the treaty itself? I think that is the challenge that we're facing as we head into this next phase of the treaty negotiations. I don't think anybody expects that this can be fully addressed at Ottawa. But what is clear is that there's a growing public interest, a growing demand from states to break open the bottlenecks that consensus is forcing us into and really begin addressing these challenges in more fundamental ways. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Melissa.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Carol. We really appreciate hearing the thoughts and the context of these previous treaties and what's happened in the past and how that has real ramifications for the negotiations as we see them going, and the challenges that are really, in some cases, not just challenges, but roadblocks when decisions have to be made by consensus. So with that, I will turn it over to Sarah Brochet, who will be able to give us some additional examples where voting is actually available and how that functions in practice. Over to you, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melissa, and thank you, CEO, for inviting me. I have prepared a few slides that I will try to share. And I am going to ask you, Melissa, to verify that you see them. I'm going to put it in presentation mode as well. Can you see this all right?
Yes, perfect.
Very good. And hello, everyone. As mentioned, I will talk a little bit about experiences from some of the other conventions on the UNEP. And as mentioned, I worked as a science advisor for IPEN, and I've been a part of the international policy space, specifically on chemicals, for about 12 years. So there's a lot of lessons learned from that I think will be relevant for the plastics treaty negotiations as well in various ways. First of all, I have already seen that there are a lot of IPENers on the call and friends of IPEN. But for those of you who do not know IPEN, it is a global network of civil society organizations. We have partners in more than 125 countries. And you see some of my colleagues on the screen here. I work for the Secretariat, so these are the people I work for. And one of the key aspects of IPEN is really bringing local priorities to an international venue, policy space for decisions, because usually local problems are also global problems, like plastics and other things. And then once there are decisions in an international policy space, also supporting work to implement that locally, to make the change that is needed. And we focus mostly on chemicals and waste and all related issues. So that's quite a wide range of issues, and plastics being one of them, obviously. And before I get into the details here, I don't think everyone is as into the details of the chemicals conventions as I am. This is my my living room, so to speak. I will focus on the Stockholm and Basel Convention today, but I also want to mention that the two others that are of the legally binding agreements that are usually included here are the Rotterdam Convention, as mentioned, and also the Minamata Convention. And all of these together tries to control in different ways with different provisions, persistent organic pollutants, or a special kind of chemicals, the trades of waste, the trade of hazardous chemicals, and also there is a convention specifically for mercury. And looking at the Stockholm and Basel Convention texts, there are provisions in the convention about voting. I do want to highlight that all these negotiations, consensus is the preferred option. This is what people work towards. This is what makes everyone comfortable. But if all efforts have been exhausted and no agreement is reached, there are provisions about how to amend the convention, how to put new annexes to the conventions, but also how to amend the annexes. And that's a 3/4 majority vote of the parties present and voting. And before I get into that, and I'm sure this is obvious to a lot of you already, but decisions that do not happen in a vacuum. There is a thorough process, both before meetings and during meetings, to make sure that all efforts are actually made to reach consensus. So no decisions just appear out of the blue in plenary in the final afternoon. That's not how it works. For all the chemicals conventions, and I'm sure that is true for all conventions in general, there are rules about when you have to make proposals available, half a year, 3 months, whatever the exact date is. For the Stockholm Convention, you have the POPs Review Committee preparing proposals that usually take 3 years in advance. So it's not a surprise when those actually comes to the Conference of the Parties. For the Basel Convention, you have technical working groups and other working groups. For the Rotterdam Convention, you have the Chemicals Review Committee, and so on and so forth. So this is a long process. And once it comes to the Conference of the Parties, or whatever the decision-making body is, you will have it introduced at the start of the meeting. There will be opportunities for parties and others to voice opinions and views in plenary. Usually, your different issues are assigned to different smaller groups to be discussed in more details. Text is being negotiated and so forth. Once the group has finalized its work, it goes back into the plenary for yet another round of discussion and comments. Usually that should be short. That should already be agreement, and then there is a decision. So there is a very thorough process, and this is generally true for all agreements. That is the diplomatic approach. But looking at the specific examples from these two conventions, I want to start with the Stockholm Convention because there was actually a vote. And this is very unusual. This is not what parties prefer. This makes everyone very uncomfortable. But there was a chemical proposed where there was these 3 years of preparatory work. It came to the Conference of the Party. It's this is probably more detailed, but it's pentachlorophenol, it's salts and it's esters. It was proposed to be listed in Annex A of the Stockholm Convention, and that means that's the strongest decision. It means that it's listed for global elimination. Let's get rid of it. At the final stage, and I mean at the very final stage, I think it was the last afternoon in plenary when this came back after a week of discussions and negotiations in contact groups, after 3 years of preparatory work, there was a party opposing adoption and said that we cannot agree to Annex A, it has to be Annex B. And that was, of course, far too late in the process. It was also made in a way that there was no, if you're in plenary, it's much harder to negotiate. So it's also made in a way that made it very difficult for any agreement to be had. And that annoyed everyone, to be perfectly frank. So there was, of course, parties expressing this polite disappointment, but also clearly in their interventions stated that all efforts to reach consensus had been exhausted. And those are the trigger words. And then they called for a vote. And once that vote was had, you had 90 votes in support. You had 2 against, and 8 other parties that just decided they didn't want to participate and didn't want to, or they didn't want to cast a vote either way. So that showed quite clearly what the majority or the overall majority of everyone wanted. So just to summarize this, you saw parties working in this collaborative manner for years and very intensely throughout the week. And then you had this last minute obstruction and people were just wouldn't have it at that stage. And looking at the vote, there was a general agreement, and that's what I, not being a lawyer, but still what I would say is consensus. It is not necessarily everyone agreeing to 100%. Everyone agreeing is better, that's the optimal outcome. But having 90 votes for and 2 against, I think is quite telling. And if you read the meeting reports, it's actually quite detailed about how the discussions were going back and forth. So if you're a meeting nerd, I can highly recommend it. It's on the UNFCCC website. And then the Basel Convention example. So this is a convention that deals with basically trade of hazardous waste and other wastes. And in 2019, Norway proposed amending this convention to also include plastic waste under a special category that is not necessarily hazardous, it can be, but it's should be controlled. And this was not only brilliant, it was also something that a few countries had strong opposition against. So once this came up to the COP, there were sort of different versions of this discussed beforehand. So again, this was not out of the blue. People knew this was coming. It had been posted at the BRS website and disseminated to parties and all of those different provisions that they had to do. And there was a very strong support by most countries. But there was one representative from a party that introduced a counter proposal that would really take away the whole point of this proposal. And this happened in plenary first day, and then everyone that wanted to discuss this went to a contract with continuing the conversations. And what happened was really the group went back and forth of how compromises could be made to accommodate the concern that this party expressed. And the text was revised, slightly changed. Yeah, I'm not going to go into the details, but there was a negotiation according to all the proper rules. And it was hard, it was very difficult. And this one party was very adamant not to accept this amendment to the convention. And that's when people started whispering about how about a vote? And it was also asked in the contact group, what are the rules for a vote? And sort of the tension was really gathering. So this was also quite a lot of drama. So what happened in the end was that this one party realized, I'm on my own here. I might have 1 or 2 other countries with me, but we are never going to win this fight. It's better to actually compromise and get the most important things to us into this decision rather than just being obstructive. So it was finally adopted in plenary, no opposition. And looking at the lessons learned here, it's really that there was really hard work by parties towards consensus. And the concerns, since they were raised in a proper manner, in the proper process, so compromises were made. It's a negotiation. But in the end, there was no vote needed because there had been a proper process. So overall, this is my final slide. Things that I think are important to remember for whatever treaty is being negotiated, that the default position of negotiators is to work toward consensus, and compromising is the norm. This is how it works. But as we have seen in many conventions, as also been very well mentioned by Carol before me, it is clear that a few or one party can stop the process moving forward or obstruct the progress of the process if there is no way to go around that. As far as I'm concerned, this equating consensus with unanimity, I mean, saying that everyone in the room has to agree, not necessarily the same things when you have so few parties opposing. If it's one party, that is not what the general agreement is. The general agreement is what the most in the room think. And from what we've seen under this convention, that the option of voting can resolve situations, even when it's only in theory, when it's only on paper. Just that is a tool that is important to have with us. And that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was really informative and really interesting to see, as both you and Carol have mentioned, that voting, in most cases, the availability of voting can just lead parties to compromise and move forward. But when that option isn't actually available, it leads to blocking when there is that availability for a single country to oppose and block progress. That's really where we run into problems. So I think, just to note also that, treaties include a whole range of different voting provisions, both for the Conference of the Parties to take decisions and to amend treaties. Generally, since the 1950s, amendment procedures in new MEAs have been the norm. But it's only been recently that there have been written rules, and yet, well, not that recently, but in the past few decades, we've seen situations where there are written rules, but then for making decisions, but then those are bracketed. So there's one approach that I wanted to mention in the BBNJ treaty, the UN Biodiversity of Areas Beyond National Jurisdiction, which was just signed in 2023. It does include in the treaty text provisions for the COP to vote. So that's a really interesting and creative approach, because that can sort of circumvent the challenges posed by the language that's frequently used, that the COP rules of procedure will be adopted by consensus. Because if one person can block what the rules are, or one country can do so, then it's more likely that they will continue to block voting, so that in the operation of the treaty and the COP decisions, they can ensure that consensus is required, and therefore vetoes are available. But we do have a lot of different and creative ways to ensure that voting is an option in treaties. So with that, I will move to questions. And first, we have a question for Carol, which is, how do you suggest that the high ambition members at the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee in Ottawa, or INC4, start addressing the decision-making issue without at the same time derailing the process, and avoiding a repeat of INC2 and Paris? Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that I would highlight here is I think one of the first and critical steps is for is for is for members of for participants in the negotiations to reiterate the critical importance of the ability to take decisions, the critical importance of democratic process, the critical importance of the vote to the long-term success of the negotiations. I think one of the same things that we've observed over the last two INCs is that relatively smaller number of countries who are vocally opposed to moving forward to votes are the most vocal about that. By contrast, we know that the overwhelming majority of states are actually very supportive of voting. I think one of the early stages in rebuilding, unblocking this, is simply for states to reiterate that. And so I think that is a critical first step. I will say that on that question of what do you do to not derail the negotiations, and this is something that you will hear many states say. Obviously, we want these negotiations to go smoothly. Um, well, look at what that achieved in Nairobi. And what it achieved in Nairobi was profound struggles to get mandates for intercessional work. It achieved, the draft, the zero draft only got bigger and more complex instead of beginning that process of becoming more focused. And I think, and here again, I would point to the lessons of the UNFCCC. And that is to say, yeah, I think that unblocking this issue, and it's really important to recognize that in Uruguay, if you look at the record, it's quite clear. In Uruguay, the rules were gavelled through by consensus, and there was an agreement in Uruguay to for parties to apply the rules on a provisional basis during the negotiations. And it was only after that was gavelled through that an objection was raised. The debate in Paris was actually over what happened in that moment. And so, which is quite different from the question of were the rules of procedure provisionally adopted? They quite clearly were, and many countries in Uruguay were quite clear about that. But this is why I think the lessons from the UNFCCC are so very important. As Sarah noted, once you have the ability to vote, it only rarely gets used because countries can count, countries can do the math. And if they are in a stark minority, they'll find ways to compromise and move on. It is once you've got the vote, the ability to vote, ironically, consensus becomes much easier to achieve because people know that if they're too obstructionist, that voting is always there as an option. Yes, resolving this issue at INC4, at INC5, whenever it happens, because it will have to happen, could take some time, and it could be rocky. But I think it's important to note that the choice is not between resolving this now and resolving it later. The choice is really between resolving this during the INC process or finding that you've lost the opportunity ever to resolve it. And that's what I think the UNFCCC teaches us. It's the difference between finding yourself facing on a road that suddenly has a big rocky patch that you're going to have to climb over. And saying, you know what, this looks a little rocky, this looks a little rough, but you know what? There's this other path over here, which, yeah, it's muddy, it's sloppy, but it looks smoother and easier. Why don't we take that smoother, easier road? And you venture into the mud, and you find that the mud with each step only gets deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper until parties are just looking for a way out of the mud and they've lost sight of the road altogether. This is the story of the UNFCCC. And this is the story that we don't want to repeat. So the choice is not, the choice is between confronting a key issue of democracy in the agreement early, or facing the very real prospect that the agreement will never achieve the goals that we've set out for it to achieve. And this is precisely why those countries that are most obstructionist are the same countries who will benefit most if the treaty doesn't achieve the mandate that was set out for it.
Thank you so much, Carol. I'm sorry, I'm multitasking and trying to answer some of the questions that have been asked in the text. So if you go there, you can look at answered questions. And then right now, I think there are a number of similar questions that my colleague David Azoulay will be able to address. So one of these asks, how are the rules of procedure themselves to be adopted by the INC? Is it by consensus majority vote, 2/3 majority? And then there is a question about the difference between voting in the intergovernmental negotiating committee in the INC and voting in the conference of the parties. So just creating, clarifying that. And there was one other question. Oh, so what happens if we fail to adopt the rules of procedure during the INCs, or adopt it without the possibility of voting? Is it still possible to renegotiate or amend the rules of procedure once COP begins? And so I think just clarifying that the rules of procedure under the INC are different from the rules of procedure in the COP, but generally the INC drafts those rules of procedure for the COP to adopt. So if you don't have the ability to reach consensus and or if you have to reach consensus in the INC, it's very unlikely that the rules of procedure for the COP would include voting. So hopefully that clarifies, and if not, David will be able to clarify. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Melissa, and thanks very much to both speaker and to everyone asking questions in the chat. I think you've responded to most of the questions around this. Most of those questions around the various procedure and the relationship between rules of procedure of the INC and rules of procedure of the COP. There's another question that I think that I would like to actually pick up on from the question list, which is, if the voting would mean that the major producers of plastics are out of the treaty, would it be acceptable? What would be the effectiveness of the treaty? I think this is a very important point, because this is one of the key arguments that is being used by countries who are refusing to vote or insisting on all decisions being made by consensus, which is, if the conversation doesn't go the way we want, we will withdraw from the conversation and from the negotiations. And I think this threat has both to be taken seriously and be looked upon realistically in terms of what would happen if that would be the case. Now, one of the risks that exists in this situation is that the treaty would develop or would adopt provisions, but that a number of countries would stay out of the treaty and would therefore be ineffective. However, this is not a new question for multilateral environmental law, and many of the treaties have developed ways to deal with that situation. Those are mostly around treaty to non-party to non-party provisions, trade mechanism. Treaties only provide or only have legal obligations for their parties. And so you cannot have legal obligations that are imposed on another party. But what you can do is regulate how the parties to the treaty will deal and will trade with countries who are not parties to the treaty. And we have this, for example, in the case of the Basel Convention, where there are very clear non-party trade provisions. And that ensures that no country can take advantage of not joining a party to undermine the party from the outside, or it makes it very, very difficult. In the case of the Basel Convention, it means that the countries that are not party to the treaty have no obligation to not export their waste, and that they can legally export their waste. But none of the party can legally import those hazardous waste. And so it creates an indirect effect. And this has two important consequences. First of all, it creates a very strong incentive for countries to become party to the treaty, because they want to make sure that if they're not going to be trading, and of course around plastic, a lot of the issue is about trading. If the countries are not going to be able to trade with the parties to the treaty, they will want to have a say in how decisions are being made. And so that creates both a protection of the integrity of the treaty and the efficiency of the treaty, and it creates a strong incentive for countries who are not yet parties to join the treaty. And that goes back to the original question. Yes, but what would happen if, what is the reality of the threat of people saying, if the treaty doesn't, if the members of the committee accept that we make decision not only by consensus, but that there is the possibility of voting, I as a country will withdraw from the negotiations. Very quickly, there would be a very strong incentive for those countries to actually come back to the table of negotiations, because if those countries are not participating actively in the negotiation in the context of the INC, of course, there will be a much higher likelihood that the members of the committee that will become the future party will adopt very strong measures between parties and non-parties. And that creates a very, very strong incentive to be part of the conversation rather than stay outside. And again, as was mentioned by the previous speakers, the voting rarely exists and is rarely taken into consideration. What it does is that it creates an atmosphere where countries are encouraged to find compromise amongst themselves and to discuss and to build among themselves. And so the fact that some decisions could be adopted by voting doesn't necessarily mean that every single provisions of the treaty would be adopted by voting. In fact, it's very unlikely that it would be the case for any of the provisions, maybe a small provision, but more likely what it would do is that it would create a treaty that is more adapted to what the vast majority of the participating members of the committee want, which is a treaty that is fit for purpose for the mandate to succeed or to respond to the mandate that all of the members of the committee have actually adopted at UNEA. And so that risk of having some of the major producer either leave the negotiations or stay outside of the party can very much be mitigated And in fact, there are very strong incentive for that threat to not be very effective because of the strong incentive that the negotiation dynamic and the party to non-party trade provision would be for those countries to come back at the table of negotiations and just actively and constructively this time engage in the negotiation.
Yeah, I'd like to just build on this a moment because it's a really critical point. And looking not only at the chemicals conventions, but looking at the Montreal Protocol, looking at CITES, that the key to the success of those treaties, the key to participation was precisely, well, you're welcome not to ratify, you're welcome not to participate in the system. But if you're not participating in the system, the countries that are part of it can't trade with you in the covered products unless you are implementing domestic measures that essentially are comparable to what the parties to the treaty are doing. And what this does is it ensures that everyone is competing on an even playing field, and it helps protect the fundamental integrity of the agreement itself. And so this is precisely why those non-party trade measures are so commonly used in agreements of this kind, because they work, because they give parties an incentive to be inside the system rather than try to free ride on it and undermine the work of others. And as David alluded, if major producer countries walk out of the negotiations and say we're not going to participate, that actually makes it all the easier for other countries to set up precisely those sorts of trade rules, because the trade rules are going to be central to the success of the treaty. And I think the last thing that I will say on this point is, if you look at the alternate option, I think the question you should ask is, all right, well, if we stick with consensus to keep producer countries who are very resistant to addressing production inside the agreement, at the consequence of which we don't address production or anything that would really meaningfully reduce plastic production, what have we accomplished? And are we accomplishing the thing that we set out to do here? And so I think that's the other side of this question that I think more countries should consider.
Thanks so much, Carol and David. So we'll move to Sarah for the next question. The question is, what role did public pressure have in achieving voting-based decision-making processes in other treaties or conventions? Are there examples of successful initiatives by observers or stakeholders that contributed to the support for voting by member states?
Thank you, and thank you for that question. I think that touches on sort of the even bigger issue about how to influence the decisions coming out of different negotiations, if it's in INC or if it's actually a treaty, conference of the party, or whatever it is. And that's knowing that the parties going to the meeting will have their positions within a certain sort of, they have some leeway, but they will have their decision coming into the meeting. So that means public pressure in a country is hugely important for the country to adopt a position coming into the meeting. And of course, they always have this is our red line. We can't move sort of beyond this in either direction, but they have leeway. But what we have seen a lot with the chemicals conventions is that the presence of toxic chemicals, the presence of a problem in a country that is highly publicized in media, that will affect policymakers. That could lead to national regulations, but also that leads to better positions of countries. So irrespective of voting or not, I would say that public pressure and doing homework before we go to the meetings and planning ahead, quite far ahead, on how to help countries adopt good positions coming into the meeting is one of the key issues. It's easy to think that all the big decisions are just decided in those big dark rooms without windows. And the final decision might be taken there, but the real work leading up to that decision is often happening in advance. So I think that is important to remember. Whether that will lead to a convention that has the provisions for voting or not, that who can tell? But I think the likelihood of getting a better outcome is much better the more that you have done your homework.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thanks so much for everyone who participated. Thanks so much to both Sarah and Carol for the excellent presentations. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get to all of the questions, but certainly feel free to reach out directly. We really appreciate having this space and working with you all in both the negotiation of the plastics treaty and work in other treaty spaces. So as I mentioned, if you have follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out directly. And we look forward to talking and working with you in person for those of you who will be in Ottawa. And with that, thank you and have a good rest of your day.